Hi guys, welcome back to my ranking series, and today we're going to be looking into a Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. That includes all original 7 movies and as well as Freddy Vs Jason and the remake from 2010. So before I get into this series, the one thing I have to mention is the Nightmare series is probably one of the main ones that I've actually watched the least out of all the franchises like Halloween, Chucky, Friday the 13th. It just didn't seem to be one of those ones that I wanted to go towards because it's more supernatural than slasher, and I love my slasher movies when I was a kid. And I think as well as memory serves me right, when I was a young kid and I did watch a couple of Nightmare movies, I didn't know which ones I watched because again I was young, but they seem to scare me a lot more than the Michael Myers and the Jason Voorhees back in the 80s. And again, that's probably because it's a dream thing and more happens in these movies. So it was quite interesting to revisit some of them because I've seen numerous ones time and time again, but there are some in the series that I've only actually watched once or twice. So it was quite interesting to watch them as an adult. Like I said, there are 9 in total, so let's get down to it. And at number 9 is Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. That's no surprise here. This entry in the series introduced the terrible shaky cam. I didn't really recognise it at first, but when I watched it again for the first time in years, I noticed there was a lot of unnecessary shaky cam in it for some reason. There are ways to use moving shaky cam to your advantage. Take Sam Raimi movies for example. However, this movie randomly just inputs these shaky moving cam moments just at random times, and it just made no sense at all. The Wizard of Oz reference at the very beginning was both funny and absolutely stupid at the same time. Again, it's something that it just didn't fit in the series. I'll try and keep this one brief because it is the worst in the franchise. The intro felt way too long. There was the endless nightmares within nightmare scenarios, and I can say that some modern movies took inspiration from this one probably, like the Scream 4 intro. That was a kind of similar to the Freddy's Dead intro. There were absolutely zero likeable characters in this movie. Not even Breek and Maya could save the movie. It was just full of your stereotypical teens from the early 90s. Robert Englund was ever present in the series, and I just can't get my head around why he even agreed to reprise his role. I think the only interesting yet weird thing about the movie was the story involving the fact that Springwood had no kids any longer, and when the teens entered the townsfolk acted all kind of weird. It was kind of like something from the Twilight Zone. I'd probably say a movie about this sort of thing would be interesting on its own merit. I always remembered the line in the movie, "Every town has an Elm Street." That's something that Freddy says in the movie, and when I was younger and I watched this movie I was thinking, he's right, every town does have an Elm Street. Maybe it doesn't, but round the corner from me there is a street called Elm Street. Fun fact.
Every town has an Elm Street.
And at number 8 is A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child. What I like about this movie and a few of the other entries is the story continuation featuring several characters from the entries before. In this case, Alice and Daniel. I always get a little miffed when they try and create these scenarios to bring Freddy back from hell after he's been defeated for the very last time in the movie before it. But a very simple way to do it is kill him in any way you want, but as long as you dream about Freddy, he's always going to return. If you dream about him, he's going to be there. This movie explores the history of Freddy a bit more with the opening scene showing how Amanda Kruger got locked up in the asylum with 100 maniacs, and you can see Robert Englund there as well. We also see some other scenes throughout the movie concerning Freddy's backstory. This was a good way of telling a story without actually making the movie solely based on his backstory. Some parts of the movie got a bit too biblical and it didn't fit into the Freddy world, but that's just a slight annoyance. I used to sing the Freddy song when I was a kid, and when I got to 9-10, instead of saying "Never Sleep Again," I used to say 9-10, he's back again. And when I watched the Nightmare movies after that, I was like, where did I get that from? He's back again? That's not what it says, it's never sleep again. And I always scratch my head and think, why would I keep saying that? I don't know why. And then when I watched this movie, one of the little girls actually says 9-10, he's back again. And I'm like, that's it, because again, this is one of the movies that I didn't watch over and over again. I only watched it a couple of times as a kid, so this is the first time watching it for about 20 years, and as soon as I saw it, memories just came back to me like that. And speaking of the kids singing the song in the movie, one of the kids is actually played by a young Marnie Patterson. And at number 7 is A Nightmare on Elm Street, the remake. Oh, this is a very, very frustrating movie. If this was the first and only Nightmare movie ever made, I'm sure most of us would be thinking it was an interesting movie that was overall decent. However, it took on the burden of a solid franchise and it tried to remake it That aspect failed miserably. An important part what made the original franchise so good was the practical effects. It's like they just ignored what we all loved and done the complete opposite. What frustrates me most about this movie is I have a love-hate relationship with this movie. I love it and I hate it, and I'll give you some examples of what I mean. Freddy, for example. I loved Freddy, I loved Jackie Earle Haley, and I loved the fact that he was so scary in this. In fact, he was as scary as hell, probably the scariest out of all the Freddy movies. However, I hated the look of Freddy. It reminded me of those Sleepwalkers from the Sleepwalkers movie. Now the cast, again, such a great cast with the likes of Thomas Dekker, Rooney Mara, Katie Cassidy. Yeah, the list goes on. I know everybody in the movie, but the list goes on. They're all great actors. But they were portrayed as these obnoxiously unlikable teens. It was more of a lazy rehash of the original rather than a modern twist or an update. Take Dawn of the Dead remake, for example. It stuck close to the original, but it updated it perfectly. And why change everyone's name in the movie bar Freddy Krueger and Nancy's first name? Also, where the hell is the famous house? Did the makers of the remake even watch any Nightmare movie ever? Part of me thinks they shouldn't even try make another remake because I can't be bothered to be disappointed again. But the other part of me thinks what could have been if Jackie Earle Haley was given a proper costume and a proper story. Overall, for a movie on its own, it was actually okay. It wasn't terrible, but for a hyped up remake, it was just majorly disappointing. And at number 6 is A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master. And this one's a direct follow-up to The Dream Warriors. Some of the cast from Dream Warriors signed up to star in the sequel, however Patricia Arquette didn't return. I was majorly disappointed that she was replaced. But her replacement was still good. Tuesday Night, that's her name, she was still good in the movie. As with most of the Nightmare movies, this one was over the top and far-fetched, but it was still a semi-enjoyable entry to the series. As always, the practical effects were excellent and the death scenes were gory as hell. One scene that always made me quiver was that elbow snapping scene. I think this movie's biggest issue was trying to emulate the greatness of Dream Warriors. The characters and story were less interesting than Dream Warriors, and some of the scenes were both cringy and unnecessary. The karate training scenes, for example, again, it was like something out of the Karate Kid. This also marks the first in the series that Freddy was full-blown comical and not scary at all. And at number 5 is Freddy vs Jason. I spoke about this movie in my Friday the 13th ranking and I gave it a pretty decent position in my ranking. And the same goes for the Nightmare on Elm Street ranking. Firstly, the acting in this movie was pretty bad for one of the most recent films in the franchise. You would expect that acting gets better as the years go by, but for this movie it just went way back. Another thing it suffers from was the stereotypical acting, and most of them were just unlikable. Mark and Will were the only two characters that I liked in this movie, and Kelly Rowland was just the worst. How many times did she say, y'all, 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 y'all better watch out?
Oh God, y'all two killers, we're not safe awake or asleep. Y'all, something's wrong.
Some of the kills in the movie were great, especially since there were two killers, so you would expect there to be competition when it comes to Freddy and Jason. I love the body snapping kill on the bed by Jason, and we finally get to see two iconic killers on the big screen fighting it out, and it was easily the best part of the movie. And the good thing about that was it was a really long fight. I'm just glad that I was an age to see this movie in the cinema. It wasn't the best movie ever made, but it was one of the first of its kind, and I'm glad I was there and old enough to see it at the cinema. And number 4 is A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. This is mostly considered one of the worst Nightmare movies among fans, but I always enjoyed this entry. Nostalgia probably had a part to play since it was one of my favourite VHS covers as a kid. I used to go into the video store, the video rental store, and just look at the horror section all the time, and I used to go to Fright Night Part 2, Return of the Living Dead Part 2, and I always went to A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2 as well. Just that front cover just had something that I just wanted to look at all the time. And this movie had some of the most memorable scenes in the whole entire franchise, and also some of the best practical effects. It was the last time we see Freddy as a totally serious, non-joking horror icon. The movie certainly has a gay vibe to it, and everybody talks about that, and I don't know if that was intentional. I don't think that sort of thing would even matter to people watching it for the first time these days. For me, Jesse and Lisa were some of the most interesting characters in the franchise. I loved Jesse screaming all the way through the movie. He even considers himself as one of the scream queens. Lisa reminded me of a young Meryl Streep. She looked and sounded like her a lot. My only issue with this movie was the relationship between Jesse and Freddy. It seemed a little too personal to Jesse and focused on him way too much. Whereas in the original, for example, it didn't matter if you lived in Nancy's house or not, he was part of your dreams. Overall, it was a solid entry to the series and it oozed 80s horror. And at number 3 is A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors. This was the first in the franchise that actually showed dreams in the way that I actually feel, in the way that I have them. With the slow running, for example, and just the kind of colourful dimensions that they put you in the movie. Out of all the movies in the franchise, this had to be the best cast. Dr. Gordon, not to be confused with Dr. Gordon from Saw, he does a bit of investigating after seeing a mysterious nun, which turns out to be Freddy's mother, and therein lies the beginning of Freddy's backstory. This part was interesting, but anytime we cut to these scenes, it took us out of the cool Dream Warriors scenario. The death scenes were very creative, and this was the first movie that had a lot of quotable Freddy one-liners. I mentioned part 2 had some of the best practical effects in the franchise, but this one, hands down, had the very, very best. The idea of bringing each other into their nightmares was new for the series, and it was a refreshing idea. This helped the story grow, and it was one of the reasons that I've held this entry so high on the list. And at number 2 is Wes Craven's New Nightmare. I think at some point this was my favourite Nightmare movie. I loved how well it was made after the slow decline in the quality of the previous sequels. It was a perfect fit for Craven to return 10 years after the original, with literally all the important characters from the original playing themselves. For a movie that came out in 1994, it was pretty advanced, especially for a horror movie. After years of Freddy becoming more campy and less scary, they really came back with a bang. I feel this version of Freddy was very menacing and seemed a lot taller as well. I don't know if it was the boots that done it. Some of the scenes from the movie seemed like they were nightmares that were ripped straight from my mind. At the time, Miko Hughes was a pretty big deal for a child actor, and his performance in this was great. My only 2 complaints with this movie was the bad acting by the likes of Bob Shaye and Wes Craven. But again, we can forgive them since they aren't really actors. And I know that Bob Shaye played a lot of cameos throughout the Nightmare series. I didn't bother mentioning that because it was just common knowledge that Bob Shaye was in most of these Nightmare movies. The CGI was pretty bad even for its time. I like that they used practical effects whenever they could, but the CGI was just awful. And no surprise, at number 1 is the original A Nightmare on Elm Street. Although the Nightmare franchise was the last to come out of all the big hitters such as Halloween, Friday the 13th and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it was one of the most consistent in terms of quality. What I mean by that is that the series had an overall average quality to it, minus Freddy's Dead. The movie stars a young Heather Langenkamp and a young Johnny Depp, as well as John Saxon and Robert Englund, of course, as Freddy Krueger. Joseph Whipp, who plays Sergeant Parker in the movie, also played Sheriff Burke in Scream. And the reason that I mention that is when I first watched A Nightmare on Elm Street, I didn't see Scream, and then I watched Scream and I love Scream. But going back to A Nightmare on Elm Street and watching that for the first time in years, you get a Scream vibe to it. The soundtrack was quite similar, the way that it was filmed, obviously it was Wes Craven that done it, and everything about it, you can tell that Scream has a lot of qualities to it because of A Nightmare on Elm Street. And after my rewatch of this movie, I also noticed more connections to It Follows from 2014. Apart from the identical streets and houses, that also had a very similar style score. This version of Freddy was one of my favourites in the entire franchise, just like A New Nightmare, because it wasn't funny at all. I do like the classic funny one-liners moments from Freddy, and he's very well known for that, but there's something more satisfying to me and more frightening about straight-talking scary Freddy Krueger. And that's all for my ranking for A Nightmare on Elm Street, guys. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope there's a lot to discuss for this one, because I know that the Nightmare franchise is one that a lot of people talk about, even more so than Halloween and Friday the 13th, and I think it is because it is a strong series overall, I will admit that. And I think after watching it, I've watched it for the past couple of days there, the full series, and I do think that this is slightly stronger than Halloween and Friday the 13th overall. Again, you're not going to beat Halloween. I love Halloween, it's one of my favourite movies of all time. As a whole, Nightmare on Elm Street is more solid overall. Anyway guys, thanks a lot for watching again, thanks for subscribing, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.